We're going to read Luke 7, verse 1 through to verse 10. So we'll read this through and then we'll take it from there. So let's read, shall we? When Jesus had finished saying all this in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. So Jesus just finished the Sermon on the Plain. So the Sermon on the Plain is hanging over this passage. There a centurion's servant whom his master valued highly was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but say the word and my servant will be healed." Interesting, the Jewish elders, they come and they say, "This man deserves you, Jesus, to come and heal his servant." And then the centurion sends a message saying, "No, I'm not worthy." Very interesting. "For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. There's a lot that we could explore in this passage, but today I want to speak about faith beyond the borders. Faith beyond the borders. I want us to come to a place of understanding that God is at work in unexpected places, in the lives of unexpected people, in unexpected situations. So we have Jesus here, and he's just finished the Sermon on the Plain, and then we're told that he goes to Capernaum. Now, why is Jesus going into Capernaum? Well, Capernaum had kind of become Jesus's ministry hub for a time for his work around Galilee, because he had been rejected from his hometown of Nazareth. I wonder if you remember what happened in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth. If you're not sure, or if you can't remember, what happened was that his hometown, his home people, tried to throw him off a cliff. Now, why did they try and throw Jesus off a cliff? The reason why they tried to throw Jesus off a cliff is because he spoke of God's favor to outsiders, to Gentiles, to people beyond the borders of Israel. Now, this idea that God would show favor to outsiders so threatened them and so angered them that the people of his hometown, they wanted to kill Jesus. And since that was the case, Jesus decided to no longer use Nazareth as kind of his ministry base, and instead he used Capernaum instead. Now, what's interesting for us as we explore this text is that Jesus references two particular accounts from the Old Testament when he speaks of God's favor to the Gentile in Nazareth. And the two accounts that he speaks of are from the prophets Elijah and Elisha. He references, you can find it in Luke 4, verses 25 to 27, but he references the widow in Zarephath, which is a very fun word to say, and Naaman the Syrian. Now, this is very, very interesting because Naaman the Syrian was a military commander who came to the great prophet Elisha for healing. And the widow from Zarephath is a widow whose son had died, and the great prophet raises her son from the dead. Now, what are the two accounts that come in Luke 7? Well, we have a military commander coming to Jesus for healing, and then we have Jesus raising from the dead a widow's son. Now, for me, the message is really clear here that the shadow of the ministry of Elijah and Elisha hover over these chapters of Luke. Luke wants us to understand that Jesus is the great prophet who stands in the line of Elijah and Elisha. Jesus operates with prophetic power, authority, and imagination, and he speaks with the authority of God. In fact, following the raising of the widow's son in Luke 7, we then have a conversation with John the Baptist, whether Jesus is the one that John spoke about. And of course, John came in the spirit of Elijah. He was the first prophet of the New Testament, really. So what's interesting to me is that in order to understand the account of the Roman Centurion, we really could do with looking at the story of Naaman the Syrian and what happens there. So what are the similarities between these two narratives? Well, you can find the narrative in 2 Kings chapter 5, Naaman the Syrian. And what we find is that both Naaman and the centurion are commanders of armies. Both belong to enemy forces. For Naaman, he belonged to the Aramean forces. For the centurion, he belonged to the Romans. Both encounter a situation beyond the reach of their own power and authority. Naaman encounters leprosy, and the centurion is his servant's illness. Both have Jewish people pleading their case. For the centurion, it's the Jewish elders, but for Naaman, it's a little Jewish girl, which is very interesting, and we will come back to that in a moment. There's political sensitivity around it. When Naaman comes to the king of Israel to present his request for healing, the king interprets that as warmongering. He sees it as a political maneuver. And in fact, when Jesus is on his way to the centurion sends servants out to Jesus to stop him from entering his household. Now, why does he do that? He says, I'm unworthy. And there is a sense in which perhaps he feels spiritually and morally unworthy for Jesus to enter his home. But also there's a political side to this, that a Jewish person was not supposed to enter a Gentile's home. And so the centurion is showing some awareness of how awkward this situation will be. What I love about Jesus, though, is that he was prepared to step over the threshold. Even though there was political tension around that kind of decision, Jesus is prepared to step in. The final similarity that I can see is that in Matthew's account of the centurion, the healing of the centurion's servant, it sounds much more personal. It's like Jesus and the centurion are having a conversation between one another. But in Luke's gospel, he makes it very clear that the conversation that happens between Jesus and the centurion is between messengers. So messengers are sent on behalf of the centurion. And actually, Jesus never meets the centurion before the healing happens. And it's the same in the story of Naaman. That as Naaman approaches the great prophet Elisha, instead of Elisha going out to meet Naaman, he sends out messengers to tell Naaman what he must do to have his healing. And so there's similarities here between Naaman the Syrian and Roman the centurion. And the more we dig into this, the more we realize why Luke wants us to connect the dots between the two. So let's look at the story of Naaman for a second, because in 2 Kings 5, verse 1, it sets up the story of Naaman. It says this: Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded. There we have another similarity. Because through him, hear this, because through him, through Naaman, the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, something wildly intriguing and unsettling for the Jewish mind has just been said there. The Lord, the covenantal God of Israel, was at work through Naaman, the commander of the army of Israel's national enemy. Military victories had been given by God to Naaman. Now, when you think about this, in that time, uh, nations belonged to gods, right? Each nation had their own particular god, and often battles were understood as a battle between gods, and the stronger the god, the strongest god was the one who won the battle. But here we have something very interesting, that the God of the Israelites is at work through another country, through another people. How unbelievably unsettling. If you're a Jew reading this, you're like, hang on a second, Yahweh is our God. We are his people. How could God possibly be at work in the life of someone else beyond our borders? And then you look at Naaman, and he is like the antithesis of everything that Israel would expect God to work through. He's an enemy. He's a Gentile. He's even a leper. He's ceremonially unclean and untouchable. The idea that God was at work through his life was offensive, disturbing, and unsettling. And yet this is what the entire account of Naaman is about. Let's go to verse 2. It says this: Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. Now, if you didn't like Naaman already, you're not going to like him now, because his military forces are responsible for kidnapping a young girl and taking her into captivity. Now, I don't know about you, but I read such passages and I think to myself, how can God be involved in such injustice? How can God allow such hardship to befall someone so innocent? And yet so often we see in the scriptures that these moments of hardship, these moments of trial and suffering are often the moments where God positions people for a purpose. We look at Moses taken into Pharaoh's household. We look at Joseph being taken into captivity in Egypt. We look at Daniel going into exile. And so to go through hardship and injustice can be a way in which God positions us to fulfill his purposes. Now, that's not to cheapen suffering or to explain it away, but it is to acknowledge that the presence of suffering and struggle, the presence of pain, is not the absence of purpose. The presence of problems is not the absence of purpose. They do not eradicate the purpose of God from our lives. And this girl, we'll see now, this little girl who's been taken into captivity, taken from our home, taken from her family, she is positioned by God for a purpose. Let's go to verse 3. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." What an incredible thing to say. This girl, taken captive, taken from her home, living with her enemies, has not become hardened to them. She's not embittered or resentful toward them or toward God. Instead, we see in her a desire to plead the case for her captors, to love her enemies. And I think one of the things that I see in this little girl is that hardship had not hardened her. She was not hardened toward others, and she was not hardened toward God. And I think that's the danger, isn't it? As we face hardship in our lives, that our hearts can become hardened towards those around us and hardened towards God. God, why would you allow these things to happen? And yet in this little girl, we see an example of something different. That when the Spirit is at work in our lives, that even when we face hardship, our hearts can remain open to others and open to God. Now, there's an interesting difference that goes on between the story of the Roman Centurion and Naaman the Syrian. The difference is in the people who plead on behalf of these commanders. So in the story of the centurion, the Jewish elders come to Jesus and they plead the centurion's case on the basis of the centurion's kindness towards them. What we see is they're operating from a worldview where there are those who deserve God's favor and those who aren't. In other words, Jesus, show kindness, show compassion to this person because he's done good to us. Right? It's a if you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of worldview. And yet in this little girl, we see something entirely different. She pleads the case for Naaman, not on the basis of what he's done for her, but on the basis of her compassion. She seeks to do good and expects nothing in return. She seeks to love her enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. That sounds an awful lot like the teaching of Jesus that we've just read in the Sermon on the Plain. This little girl pleads for her master, and in doing so, she is a foreshadow of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And isn't it so interesting? What does Jesus say? That we should be childlike in our faith. I find it so interesting that in this story you have Jewish elders and a little girl, and it is the little girl who is to be our example. What are we to be? We are to be open to others and open to God in the midst of hardship. We are to pray for our enemies. We are to plead their case. We are to show compassion, not on the basis of what other people have done for us, but purely on the basis of our love for God and our love for people. Now, moving forward a little bit, we're going to have to move forward quite quickly here. We see that Naaman, when he's told about the possibility of being healed by the prophet Elisha, he comes to Elisha, and in chapter 5, verse 9, it says this: "So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house." Now, just look at the way that he approaches Elisha here. He approaches Elisha as a man of power, on horseback. He's demonstrating his military might, his authority, and his strength. In fact, we see even later that he's a man of national pride. And what does Elisha do as this man by horseback approaches him? He sends out his servants to greet them. There's no personal touch. There's no affirmation of Naaman's position or his power as his authority. He says, just go to the Jordan and your flesh will be restored. He doesn't even talk to him. And actually what happens is Naaman is outraged by this. He's outraged at the process of healing. He even says, his position deserves more dignity and respect than this. And what we see here is that Naaman, in this process of healing, is being humbled. He's going through a process of humbling. He's advised by a slave girl. He's greeted by a servant. He receives no special intention. And then he's told that he needs to go and find cleansing, not in the superior waters of his homeland, but in the rivers of the Jordan, which are far worse in his mind. And what's interesting is that after he is healed, he returns to Elisha, not on horseback, but he stands before him. He's gone through a journey of humbling. Now, if we look at the centurion, we see something very different. Instead of seeking personal affirmation, or having Jesus enter into his homes, the kind of the affirmation that would come with that, he's more concerned with the reputation of Jesus than his own reputation. So he says to Jesus, don't come in because it's too politically awkward for you. It was unimaginable for a Jew to enter the house of a Gentile. So he says, essentially, the Jewish elders go and they say, this man deserves to be healed. But then the centurion says, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I do not even consider myself worthy to come to you. You see, Naaman comes to the great prophet to be humbled. But in the centurion, we see him affirmed by Jesus because of his humility. And actually, I think just a little side note here, there is a link, there's a connection between great faith and great humility. The two seem to go hand in hand. And in fact, the incredible thing about this narrative, and we'll bring it to a close here, is, as I like to say, we're coming into land. That when we look at the story of the centurion, we've just had Jesus teaching, and what he's been teaching on the Sermon on the Plain, he's been teaching to love your enemies, to do good without expecting anything in return. And actually what we see is that the centurion is the embodiment of this. Who is it that has loved his enemies without expectation? It's the centurion who's shown kindness to the Jews, who has given without expecting in return. The centurion, he's done good, but then he comes to Jesus and he says, I don't want you to come on the basis of what I've done. Who has acknowledged their need of God? Who is it that has shown concern for the reputation of Jesus? Who is it that has placed their faith in Jesus' power and authority over life and death? Here is a Gentile, a Roman military commander who is more open and faith-filled than Jesus' own hometown. And in fact, this is the incredible thing, that there's only 2 times where Jesus is amazed at people's faith. In the Gospel of Mark, we're told that Jesus is amazed at the lack of faith of the people of Nazareth, his hometown. And here we find him with a centurion, with someone outside the borders of Israel, and he is amazed at his faith. So what do we learn? To be a disciple is to be like the little girl who has not been hardened by hardship, but still loves her enemy, who gives without expectation. We've learned that there's a link between great faith and great humility, that the presence of pain does not mean the absence of purpose, that the gospel does not belong to any one nation or people group or empire. The power of the gospel is that it can permeate every culture and every people group. Our hope is not in some kind of Christian nation state. The gospel moves beyond our borders. So my prayer for us is that the Lord would teach us the way of humility, that the Lord would teach us to be open, that we would not be hardened by our hardship, but open to God and open to the people around us. So Lord God, teach us the way of faith, teach us the way of humility, teach us the way of dependency. Help us not to put confidence in our own strength, but to rely on you. We come to you undeserving. We come to you reliant on your compassion towards us. Help us, Lord, to be more concerned with your reputation than our own. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.